If you means that do it.
Welcome to the second hour of Air Checks. Here's an interview about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as Ian Johnson at the BBC of Douglas Adams.
To mark the 20th anniversary of the first ever broadcast of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams was invited to be interviewed by me, Ian Johnston, for BBC Radio 4. Not just about his one particularly successful idea, however, but about his life, the universe, and indeed everything. I was interested in finding out more about the influences that eventually brought about the Hitchhiker's Guide. So, as we settled down to a long chat over a cup of tea, I began by asking him about his decision to study at Cambridge University. A calculated move, as it turns out.
My sole purpose in wanting to go to Cambridge was that I wanted to join Footlights. Just as a sidebar, I would say it's interesting that people rather look askance and raise their eyebrows a little bit, that there seems to be a sort of golden pathway leading from Footlights into the media. And they say, how come so many people come out of Footlights going to the media? And which is actually the wrong way to see it. It's so many people go into Footlights because they want to go into media, and they go there because they hope to meet other people of a like mind. So saying, isn't it funny that so many people come out of Footlights and go into the media, is rather like saying, isn't it a bit odd that so many people who like yachting join a yachting club? You know? Anyway, I went up to Cambridge determined I wanted to join Footlights. And my first experience, I have to say, was very off-putting because I found, and this is just the perception of a sort of green young kid going up in the first place, I found everybody rather sort of grand and aloof and rather sort of cold and unencouraging. And as a consequence, I didn't actually go and join, and instead I went and joined a thing called CUELS, the Cambridge University Light Entertainment Society, which existed to do a similar kind of job by writing and doing shows, but it was for charity. So we'd go off and do shows in hospitals and prisons and so on. And I must say, I blush with shame now to think about it. I mean, I remember we went to do a show, I think, at Chelmsford Prison, where we were roundly booed and barracked by the prisoners. When I think of the sort of clever dick material we were probably sort of showing, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, sort of dreadful undergraduates. And anyway, I think it was in it was after a few terms had gone by, somebody encouraged me to go and have another go at Footlights. So I went I prepared a couple of sketches with a friend of mine to audition material for one of the Footlight Smokers, a strange term for the couple of informal reviews that would get held every term, where people can put on anything they like, but you've got to get it past the audition first, and then you go on. And anyway, this one was being run by Simon Jones, who, unlike all the other people I'd met at Footlights at the time, was incredibly friendly and encouraging. And as a consequence, I then got very involved in Footlights. And one of the things I got very frustrated about in Footlights was that it seemed to have changed what I had thought were the sort of primary function of Footlights, which was for writer-performers. And while I was there was a sort of mood afoot which said, no, writers should write and we get the best performers to come and perform the material. Let's be professional about it. I thought, well, this is rather odd. I mean, you look at the Pythons, who, I must say, loomed very, very large in my mind and imagination at that time. That seems to me, the most wonderful and exciting and innovative type of comedy imaginable, and that's the whole thing is based on the idea of writer-performers, and that's really what I felt very wedded to, and what I thought Footlights had traditionally been wedded to. But no, while I was there, as I say, the view was prevalent that writers should write and actors should act. So as a consequence, I did one or two other shows with some similarly frustrated and of a like mind people that I met there, called Martin Smith and Will Adams, no relation. So we put on our own shows that were just us writing performing, which really went extremely well. And in the end, a lot of our material went to Footlights, but I wasn't cast in the big May Week review, and I still simmer and seethe about that. It still makes me really cross. But anyway, the show that was in my last year, the big Footlights May Week review, which was called, and I make no apologies for the title because it wasn't mine, I didn't have anything to do with it, Chocks. And it was the height of glam rock, and the whole thing was really kind of rather sort of awful in a curious kind of way. But there were some sketches in it that I had written or co-written. And when the show went into the West End, as happens sort of once in a blue moon with Footlights shows, they go into the West End, whereupon it suddenly becomes appallingly obvious how amateurish they are. Dutifully, a lot of old Footlights alumni turned up on the first night, including various Pythons and goodies and so on and so forth. And amongst them was Graham Chapman. And so I met him afterwards, and he said, who wrote this sketch? And I said, oh, well, I did, as a matter of fact. And he said, oh, that's good, that was good. And who wrote that sketch? And I said, oh, well, I did, as a matter of fact. And he said, oh, well, come up and have a drink sometime. So I did. And I think that was at the point that Python had entered one of its sort of latent periods. And so Graham and John were not working together at that point. And Graham tends to thrive best on writing partnerships rather than writing by himself. And that's true with an awful lot of comedy writers. So he was looking for somebody else to sort of knock stuff around with. So one thing led to another, and I ended up actually working with Graham for about a year. And I mean, it's not telling tales out of school, because I think this is well known, but Graham was having a fairly severe drink problem at the time. I mean, it was sort of a couple of bottles of gin a day. And this tended to mean that we weren't quite as productive as we might otherwise have been. And there tend to be sort of 3-hour lunch breaks. So in the end, we didn't produce as much or as maybe incandescently good stuff as might have been produced in other circumstances. But it was a very interesting period. And one of the things that came out of it was this television show called Out of the Trees. And I'm struggling to remember very much about it now, other than Simon was in it, Graham obviously was in it, Mariah Aitken was in it, and the thing was, I would say, semi-funny. Semi-funny.
These early beginnings and early shoulder rubbings with talented people were to pave the way for Douglas to make his mark on BBC Radio. And it wasn't too long after that, of course, that his sketch-writing career had to be put on hold in favour of grappling with the writing of an experimental sci-fi comedy series. Since the first broadcast of Hitchikers coincided with huge interest in the film Star Wars and, of course, real-life explorations of the final frontier, one might presume that Douglas was picking up the interplanetary excitement of the time and consciously reflecting that back in his work. But apparently not.
Comedy was much more of an influence than science fiction itself. I mean, Star Wars, we began to be aware of the fact that Star Wars is coming while we were making it. I mean, everybody sort of said, oh, well, this will be good, this will be great, because it'll create a sort of, an appetite in the public's mind for science fiction. I felt slightly annoyed, actually, because I didn't want it to feel as if, because the inevitable happened, despite the fact that the radio show came out, whatever it was, a month or something like that, after the film. Everybody sort of said, oh, the BBC is jumping on the bandwagon, as if the whole thing had been written and produced and so on in that brief month. So I was slightly aware that it might be seen that one was jumping on the coattails of the other, which is, of course, is completely ridiculous. But so I think I was slightly annoyed at that coming out at that moment. But which is silly of me. Now, and I think comedy generally and Python particularly were much more of a strong effect than other things that were happening in science fiction. I think one of the things that influenced it as far as Python is concerned, and this sounds like an over-literal rationalization after the event, and I think the reason it sounds like that is because it probably is, but we'll go for it anyway, which is watching Python, you'd see some weird or extraordinary premise that informed a whole world that would then be played out in 2 or 3 minutes. And then it's all gone and you go on to a world in which there's a different insane premise underlying it and so on. And it always seemed to occur to me, and Python started to go in this direction sort of very vaguely towards the end, when there were 1 or 2 shows that told a sort of story from beginning to end. I just thought it'd be interesting to take a sort of wild or absurd premise and give it consequences. Play it through. Force yourself to follow the logic of it, because it just seemed to be an unexplored territory that kind of excited me, which was why, starting off with that idea of the guy whose house gets demolished and then the Earth getting demolished. That's the point where, if it was a sketch, that's where you finish. Oh, the Earth has got demolished now. But then you say, well, okay, so what next? What happens as a consequence of that? Let's stay with it and see where this goes. So really, I wanted to try and make the sort of things that would happen absurdly in Python, and you knew this wasn't the real world. You wanted to say, this is happening in the real world, this strange or extraordinary thing. And I guess what was going on in my mind is that there's always stranger and weirder stuff going on in the world than we kind of acknowledge. I'm not being X-Filesy about this. I hate all that kind of stuff. What I'm saying is that it's more like... I don't know, I've only just remembered this connection, and I don't know, I may be inventing a connection because I can't remember when I read it. But I remember reading Tolstoy's Resurrection. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Well, I remember when I read it, and almost expecting it to be to become a kind of sort of cult book in the 70s, because that was at the time when there was an awful lot of... At kind of sort of student level, there's an awful lot of support for things like the IRA and so on and so forth. It was a very sort of fashionable and romantic cause, and any terrorist organisation tended to be romantic and fashionable. And the interesting thing about Resurrection is that the story is simply this, that a nobleman finds himself discharging one of his regular duties as a justice of the peace. A woman comes up in front of him charged with prostitution, and he hands down the regular sentence for such a thing. But her face seems vaguely familiar. Can't think why. But anyway, he hands down the sentence that tradition demands. And then he subsequently figures out why she's familiar, which is that she was a serving girl in the house of a nobleman who was a friend of his, and he went and stayed there and seduced her. And basically he seduced her on the grounds that if she didn't come across for him, it would go the worse for her because, she would be fired. And of course what happened is she becomes pregnant and becomes fired for being pregnant. And then once she's pregnant, has a child, the only course open for her is prostitution. And so you see all this suddenly connecting and igniting in his mind as he realizes that he has absolutely been the instrument of this woman's downfall. And gradually sees that polite society, which is moral, upright, and so on and so forth, is absolutely corrupt at a level that is absolutely invisible to those people who are part of it. And there was just a momentary move, a momentary sort of chink in the curtain through which he saw the actual truth. And the book then goes on to develop the idea, or explore the idea, that there is no such thing as an innocent society. And therefore that becomes, if you like, a manifesto for certain types of terrorism, if you like, saying that there is no such thing as an innocent member of a society which is not innocent itself, and therefore that's a justification of terrorism. Anyway, that's all by the by. But what made a profound impact on me about that story was simply the fact that things are not as they seem. I don't mean because there may be aliens wandering around or anything like that, but because we live in a world which we accept at one level because it's very convenient for us and because we make all sorts of comfortable assumptions. But when you look at it from some other point of view, it suddenly looks wildly and extremely different. And I think that's an idea that's kind of obsessed me all the way through. What other point of view can you see this event from that suddenly makes it seem very, very strange and unusual and unreal when normally it appears to us to be a very normal event? Again, this is all post hoc rationalization, but I guess when you look at that opening story, Guy gets his house demolished, and we think a certain way about it. You read about it in the papers, and maybe you'll be engaged by it, or maybe you won't be engaged by it, or maybe you'll think, oh, just some other thing. But then it happens at another scale. The world gets demolished for the same reason, and suddenly, it looks very, very differently to you. Now, where I guess I began to sort of think about this after I'd done Last Chance to See, and I went off to do that, going around the world looking for various rare and endangered species of animal with the zoologist Mark Carwardine. And I went off to do that because I wanted to, and you only figure it out afterwards. And I discovered the thing that was most fascinating was trying to see the world through the perceptual framework of a completely different animal, and seeing a world that's familiar to us, but seen from a different perspective, through a different set of eyes, out of a different body, with different things it needs to achieve in order to survive. And suddenly the world looks staggeringly different. And that was a thing that continually fascinated me. So I think that's kind of a prime mover. How do events look when you see them from a different point of view?
In that first episode, the characters in the bar are almost casual when they know the world is coming to an end, and yet you do. I mean, it's a very cruel thing to end the world, isn't it? It's not like H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, where there's total panic. I mean, you do it in the most bland way. Well, that, I suppose, is humour, is it?
I suppose it is, actually. Well, I guess the thought in my mind was that, remember this is a pub, and a lot of stories and ideas circulate around in pubs, and people don't really sort of pay much attention to them. And it's my guess. Obviously, I've never been in the end of the world, but my feeling was that it was too big an idea for people to grasp, and that they would just sort of say, "Oh well, last orders then," and just think about some sort of tiny little aspect of it and not deal with the thing itself. I remember doing a similar thing at the beginning of Life, the Universe and Everything, which starts when Ford and Arthur mysteriously materialise along with a Chesterfield sofa in the middle of Lord's cricket ground in the middle of a test match. And at one point I just had this little line about a lot of people in the crowd couldn't cope with watching it and listened to it on the radio instead. And I think people do, if something doesn't fit into your frame of reference, you just put it aside. There was a later book I wrote, The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, that was talking about the idea that if there are immortal beings, then it follows logically they must still be around. How come we don't know of them? And I began to think, well, even if they were around, even if they were around and completely visible, we would actually somehow just filter it out. So, I mean, imagine there was Thor around. And not only was he around, but he did walk around in great sort of, horned helmet with a hammer and sort of great yak skins all around him. I know it wouldn't be yak, whatever it was. I mean, and supposing he walked into a pub and said, "Hello, I'm Thor," people say, "Oh, get away! You know, I'm having a chat." And he could then prove to you he was Thor, you know, by summoning up a thunderstorm, and you still really wouldn't want to know because it doesn't fit into your frame of reference. So I began to think of these characters wandering around, completely disabled and neutralised by the fact that nobody would even notice they were there. So I think that, we just filter out things that don't fit into our frame of reference. And I guess, that goes back to the Tolstoy resurrection thing. We construct a worldview that is convenient and comfortable for ourselves. And, what has always fascinated me is the things you can sort of wedge into that, sort of force it open.
With so many intellectual manoeuvres going on, it was necessary in Hitchhikers to have a normal person involved in the plot, someone who sees things from a normal point of view, and can question what's going on behalf of the rest of us. In this case, the character was Arthur Dent, and the casting led to a reunion with Simon Jones from the Cambridge days.
I think, Arthur was my everyman, and I think it's not entirely surprising that he was a sort of tall, dark-haired, university-educated person. So, in a sense, Simon was my idea of just an ordinary sort of person that I would know and understand and could write from that point of view. So, that's in a way answering a slightly different question. And people sort of said, is Arthur me? And I say, no, he's just my idea of an ordinary guy. But of course, my idea of an ordinary guy, strangely enough, is me. And Simon was very good at articulating, if you like, that particular voice that I have in my head. And I think that there is a characteristic that Arthur and I share that I think I kind of project onto Simon, but probably unfairly, which is, Simon is one of these people. Simon is actually one of the world's most, I don't know if you know him, but he's one of the most charming and delightful people. And he's smarter than he lets on, because he has this slightly sort of fluffy, actory way that slightly, if you like, sort of does a little bit of a sort of dance of the seven veils in front of his true intelligence. Would you say that was fair?
Very much so,
Yeah.
Yes.
And now, I'm actually not like that, but there is a characteristic that's a little bit close to that, which is of, and that this is me and this is also Arthur, that on the one hand is really genuinely startled and bewildered by some of the things you see happening. And it looks as if you're actually being dumb to be startled by it. But actually what's happening is that in some ways you're actually seeing it slightly more clearly, if you like, than... If you like, it's, I don't know, sort of stretch the point, but it's like going back to the sort of, the Tolstoy thing of just seeing a little bit more. And there, I'm not explaining this very well. Let me come back at it from another angle. I think the problem here, I'm actually answering a different question than you asked.
No, but it's interesting. It's because it's about you. Is it because you see not only the object, but the particles that make up the object? Would that be
well,
that
in a way,
sort of...
the thing is, I'm always absolutely astonished by light switches. Because, you look at that light switch over there, and it's just, it's 4 square inches on the wall, and when you push it, the light goes on. But what's behind that is a wire that goes from there. Not just the wire doesn't just go from there, round the wall up to the light. It goes all the way to the nearest power station, and you've got these huge, great turbines, whether it's gas or nuclear power, churning out this stuff connected to a wire that allows that to turn on that. So to me, light switches are completely astonishing things. But on the other hand, if you say, "My God, it's a light switch," people think, well, yes, it's a light switch. And I think that that Arthur is continually astonished by things that happen, not because he's dumb, but because he's a little bit more intelligent. But that's a little bit more intelligent that looks to the world like being excruciatingly dumb. So he always seems rather slow on the uptake, but he actually gets there. I mean, I remember... I hope this doesn't sound too self-serving, but I was aware when I was at school, I'm explaining this to myself again later on, that I would veer between doing extremely well and extremely badly. And what would determine that was whether I actually understood something or not. Now, most people, I think, in my experience, are content merely to remember, but I can't remember if I don't understand. So there would be things, in chemistry or physics or maths or anything else. I could remember it once I understood it, but I couldn't possibly remember it until I understood it. And I think a number of people are content to be able to remember. I couldn't do that, and I would worry away at something and seem to be dim, because I didn't get it and I didn't understand it. But I think I was kind of after I needed more real sort of logical support for something before I could accept it. And I was always, I remember at school, and indeed up until now, I was always thought to be very gullible, because if somebody would sort of suddenly say, this most extraordinary thing has happened, I would actually see the possibility that it could have done before I would see the possibility that he was just sending me up. And because I think I'm kind of alive to the fact that life continually throws very, very strange and unexpected things at us that a very short while later you fitted into your mental landscape and have forgotten how strange it was when you first came across it. I think I'm quite good at, or I like to keep in my mind, keep at the forefront of my mind, how strange things are when you first come across them. I think, going back to Last Chance to See, what was particularly gripping to me about that was when I set out to do it, I actually didn't know very much about these issues, about ecology, about endangered species, specifically about evolution. And so I was sort of encountering these things as an innocent, as a layman, and gradually sort of learning and sharing, if you like, that experience of learning. And I've noticed that generally, if I have to explain something to somebody, I'm usually quite good at it because I can remember what it was like not to understand it and how strange and bewildering it looks. And most people, when they have to explain something complicated, because it seems very simple and obvious from their standpoint, don't actually explain it properly in terms that somebody to whom this is all new will necessarily understand, because what you've forgotten is how strange it was to you to begin with.
Do you accept the inexplicable moments of, say, synchronicity or telepathy?
No, to be honest. I mean, I am actually, if you like, an extreme rationalist. I'm a Dawkinsist. And what fascinates me is that from profoundly simple principles, from almost tautologically simple principles, the universe has erupted into the most extraordinary, complex, rich thing imaginable. Words fail one trying to describe the complexity of the universe. But to my mind, it is much, much more intellectually and emotionally thrilling understanding or having some glimpse of the way in which extraordinary simplicity has naturally given rise to this extraordinary complexity. That is a thrilling and extraordinary process. And saying, oh, well, it's because we have complexity, therefore there must be a very complex reason for it, or there must be something mystical, or me to be a very unsatisfactory explanation for that. So I feel intensely romantic, if you like, about logical explanations. It's interesting, I mentioned the X-Files very briefly earlier, and I get very, very impatient with the X-Files. I remember back to its precursor in some ways, Doomwatch. I don't know if you remember Doomwatch. where mysterious, strange events would occur, and there would always, at the base of it, be a simple explanation. And that was always gripping. That was fascinating. Of course, that's where Sherlock Holmes came from, that he actually had very simple, clear explanations for these very bizarre and strange events. And the thing that I bridle against in the X-Files is that the person who is seeking for the logical, simple explanation is held up for derision. And, week after week, it's the spooky answer that's the right one. I just think this is nonsense.
Douglas, quite apart from the people, one of the great pieces of Arthur C. Clarke foresight was, of course, the electronic notebook that Ford Prefect has. How did that come about?
Well, it wasn't actually technological foresight. It was really, some sort of science fiction is specifically predictive, and you mentioned Arthur C. Clarke, and I guess he's the foremost example of predictive science fiction writing. I really didn't see myself as doing that, and the guide itself was purely a narrative device. I said that to begin with, Ford, I needed an outside perspective, and I'd had the idea of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy just as a book, and that he would be a researcher for that. And I thought, well, if it's going to be a book, it's probably got to be slightly sort of higher tech than just something made out of wood pulp that you can flip through. So it had better be, I think calculators are just beginning to arrive at that time, so I thought, well, it's a bit like that. But it also, it performed a very useful narrative function. When I'm working forwards on a story, a lot of ideas tend to sort of come off the flywheel, and the guide itself began to be a very useful vehicle for dealing with those ideas that spin off the flywheel, that have at best a tangential, if we shall say, a tangential connection with the actual plot. So really, all the way through the radio series, really not much mention is made of what it looks like and how it functions. We then had to deal with that a little bit when we came to put it on television. And also when I wrote the book, I had to describe it a bit. And the description that circumstances more or less sort of forced me into giving of it, which was, it was like a sort of large pocket calculator with a sort of window at the top and lots of buttons. It was... and in fact, it was anything but prescient, because what I say is that you have to look up what the subject you're interested in an index, and then enter that number on the keypad in the front, and it'll come up. So it really wasn't prescient. As I say, it was a narrative device that circumstances then forced me to flesh out in a way that there was no other way of doing it. And of course, what's happened now is, we do have devices like that, beginning to inhabit our world. Not quite as advanced as what I described, but they will be here very, very soon. And the interesting thing from my point of view is that I originally created this as a fictional device, and in fact, my company, the Digital Village, is currently working to develop an actual thing, not as a piece of hardware, but as an online guide service. Very, very much based on elements of that original conception. So I guess there is a bit of sort of Arthur C. Clarke-ness here, because something that started as a fictional thing that I invented, I'm helping to sort of godfather the creation of the real thing in the real world many years later.
It's perhaps no wonder that in Douglas's world, the essential, profound meaning of the universe could be calculated to be a very straightforward 42. This has subsequently become such a celebrated number that I felt I had to ask how it came about.
Like any idea, there are lots of strands that lead towards it. Now, the thing was, I liked the idea of... there's almost a fairly sort of standard thing of, some sort of pathetic punchline to, with somebody going off and seeking enlightenment. There are, the Buddha saying this, or the teacher saying that's kind of surprise at the end. I think there was even one, I was a great fan of Procol Harum. In fact, the idea for Restaurant at the End of the Universe actually came from a Procol Harum track called Grand Hotel. And then there's this story in one Procol Harum track about somebody going off to find a teacher on a mountain and asking for enlightenment. And so it's a well it's a well-trodden path. What actually is the answer? So I started to thinking something along these lines, and gradually thought, well, that the answer. It eventually occurred to me that the answer should be a number, and that because it would be so completely inexplicable, but also so completely banal, that there was a good joke out of it. If you'd build it and build it and build it and build it and say, well, the answer is 42, or it's a number. I thought that was it. So it was then a question of trying to identify the right number and find the number that the joke would be. And I went through a number of different thoughts, because I was thinking, well, numbers are kind of neutral, aren't they? But actually they're not. We do associate different things with different numbers. I mean, 7 is meant to be a mystical number, 3 is meant to be a mystical number. There are all sorts of... So I thought, well, okay, so what sort of character of number are we going to go after here? And I thought, well, since the joke is merely the fact that it's a number, the number itself should be unremarkable in some way, because otherwise it might slightly deflect attention from the joke if people think that the number itself has any significance. That'll momentarily distract from the joke, because the number's got to have no significance whatsoever. So I thought, well, how do you find a number that's got no significance? Well, first of all, we'll say it's an even number. I mean, I know there are just as many odd numbers, but there's something about odd numbers, isn't there? So
They're more interesting.
So I thought the odd numbers are slightly more interesting than even numbers, so I'll go for an even number. So obviously it's not going to be a prime. Well, obviously all prime numbers are odd numbers, but I got rid of primes, and also, the sort of the comic, the sort of comedy writer's knee jerk, which would be to say, oh, it's 17 3/8, because that's obviously a funny number. So I was beginning to think about, what constitutes a funny number that isn't a funny number. And then something began to swim back into my head. Because a few years earlier, I had been working as a prop borrower on one of John Cleese's video arts films. Now, for those who don't know, John had this highly successful company called Video Art, which still goes, still of course thriving. But he started it, making training films, management training and so on and so forth. And in each case, the principles that any particular film would be about were illustrated by little sketches that John had written. They were very carefully crafted, of course, them being John. And anyway, I think the very, very first films he made on a sort of shoestring budget. And he gave me the job of being prop borrower, because they didn't have the funds for a prop buyer. And so one of the scenes was set in a bank, and John is playing a bank teller who is not paying attention to the customer's needs. And so he's sitting there adding up a column of figures, and the customer comes to the window. John doesn't pay any attention to him. So eventually the customer moves on to the next teller, who treats him properly, deals with his problem. And then as the customer, I think it was Tim Brooke Taylor, walks back past John, John finally comes up with the figure which he was adding up. And I just suddenly remembered a bit of discussion having gone on in the lunch break about what will be a good number, what will be a funny number. And I tried to cast my mind back to what it was. And I wasn't even sure that I got it right, but I seem to remember that the number that John came up with as being the right funny number to say as Tim Brooke Taylor went by, I mean, this is terribly arcane, was 42. So I thought, well, I'm not sure if it's right, but that's the number I'll use. And it seems to fit all the criteria that it's just a very, very ordinary, unremarkable number. So that's it. That's where it came from.
But in headlines last year, in some way too arcane for me to understand, 42 was seen by some scientists to be indeed part of the solution to the universe.
Well, it was an approximation of the Hubble constant, which is a sort of measure of the distribution of stars through the galaxy. Through the is it star? Oh dear, I should know. But no, I mean the funny thing about that is that once you've selected a number and it achieves thereby a certain notoriety, Of course, any other, it therefore self-selects coincidences. So people will say, my God, isn't it extraordinary coincidence that the number crops up here, there, and everywhere, and people do all sorts of numerology on it. If you add together the letters of somebody's name and all this kind of stuff. But the thing is, if it had been 37 or 17 or 28, the same thing would have occurred, but with a different set of phenomena. So it's all pure coincidence, and it's self-selecting coincidence. And no, the fact that it is an approximation of the Hubble constant, I think, needn't detain us.
Having addressed yourself in comedy, but thoroughly, to the answer to life and the universe, and indeed everything, do you, Douglas, have a belief in God?
No, absolutely not. No, I am very much a radical atheist, which is interesting. I do firmly say I'm an atheist and not an agnostic. It was quite an interesting progression because I was brought up very much as a Christian and was very strongly so. I was the sort of chapel warden and sacristan and so on at school and all that kind of thing, and really sort of took it terribly seriously. I think what began to bother me was the fact that when I was at school, I was taught history really rather well. We were taught logic. We were taught physics very well. We were taught all sorts of logical subjects really rather well. And what we were always taught was how to spot fallacies in arguments, how to construct arguments properly, how to and how to spot when shortcuts are being taken, and just logical fallacies and so on. And at the same time, one's being taught religion, and you can't help notice that all of the things you're being taught in every other field militate absolutely against this, against the way you're taught religion. It's as if a door closes and you're suddenly told, no, you can't ask questions here. I know this may sound absurd, but it's therefore your job to accept it. And people think, hang about. I guess I hadn't really formulated that sort of thinking yet in my mind, but what triggered it was coming across a street corner evangelist, and dutifully I stopped and listened to him, and gradually the sort of cold sense went up and down my spine as it began to be borne ineluctably upon me that he was talking complete nonsense. And so there was a sort of battle going on in my mind that I should be dutifully accepting this. On the other hand, it was clearly nonsense. So I gradually sort of slipped into being an agnostic. When I say agnostic, being agnostic is often shorthand for don't really know and I'm not really going to think about it. But I did spend many years thinking about it. And I think the thing that enabled me to sort of emerge at the other end of agnosticism as a thoroughgoing atheist was actually reading Richard Dawkins's books and suddenly seeing what an extraordinary, fantastic, inexhaustibly rich and complex universe this was, and how the explanations for it offered by religion were piffling little man-made answers that were really very, very small and unimaginative. And that was an enormous shock of understanding for me. When I remember having a fascinating conversation 3 or 4 years ago with Robert Hind, who was the Master of St. John's College, Cambridge, and a very, very leading zoologist. And we were talking about the subject of God at one point. And I said, it's interesting, it seems to me, that a certain number of physicists believe in God, but I don't find many others. And he said, well, the interesting thing about that is if you're a biologist, you actually understand how life works, and you know that no other explanation is A, required, and B, any other explanation merely sort of gets in and muddles it all up. So we're used to that. So no self-respecting, no biologist worth his salt remotely thinks there's a God. On the other hand, physicists are used daily to thinking about things that are thinking complete fantasy, so they don't really have so much difficulty with it. But the thing is, a lot of people think that the scientific view There's an awful lot of anti-science at the moment. People are very suspicious of science because they're suspicious of technology and they're suspicious of what they see as being reductionism. And reductionism is thought to be a rude word because it suggests that the universe is something sort of soulless and mechanical. But what has been absolutely fascinating to me is the understanding that the process by which enormous simplicity achieves enormous complexity is the most gripping and enthralling and exciting and intellectually stimulating and challenging vision there is. So far from rendering the universe thereby sort of soulless or bleak, it makes one feel that the fact that one has 70, 80, 90, whatever it is, years of living in this extraordinary thing and having the opportunity to come to terms with some tiny little corner of it and some tiny little vision of the vast complexity, which you can scarcely consider. It's worth 70 years of anybody's time, as far as I'm concerned.
Do you think your time, you're still a young man, so far has been well spent, or do you occasionally have a waking thought in the night that maybe you should have become a physicist, maybe you should have done a serious scientific joke instead of making fun of it?
Oh, I have... hardly a waking moment goes by that I don't think that. I mean, there are all sorts of different things I would love to have done. And I'm also very conscious just of time wasted in my own career when I've not been sure what to do next, and I've been, I've wasted a lot of time, and I'm suddenly terribly conscious of this, because when you pass 40, and I'm well past 40, you suddenly become aware that the fact that all of the things on your agenda, you're not going to do them all. But no. It's curious thinking back to when I was at school and university and really having not the faintest idea of what else there was to do out there, and slipping into the world of writing and entertainment simply because it loomed quite large in my sort of imagination and I couldn't really think of anything else to do. I think at one point when I was at school, rather sort of reluctantly, I thought, well, maybe I could go and work for Pilkington's Glass. Maybe glass is interesting. But I just couldn't see anything else. And I mean, then I thought, well, the BBC, of course, is an interesting place to go. But there seems to be little chance of getting into the BBC. Well, I don't know.
Go on, say something rude.
No, little do you know, once you get in, a little chance of getting out. Well, that's just a joke about the labyrinthine nature of Broadcasting House, and a feeble one at that. Where were we? But now, looking back, I can see infinite sort of possibilities that I simply had no idea about at the time. So, if I could replay my life several times, I would certainly, one of me would go off and be a zoologist. Absolutely, definitely. I think it's the most gripping and fascinating field. And it's only because we've now got tools by which we can understand zoology. Previously we didn't. Previously zoology was purely a descriptive science. And suddenly Darwinism has suddenly erupted into being a model not only for zoology, but for virtually any phenomenon you care to examine. And to be honest, what has enabled us to do that and to see it so clearly is the advent of fast computers and an understanding of the way in which, as I say, complexity arises from simplicity. Which brings us on to the subject of computers, and another part of me would have loved to have been a computer scientist. It is an enormously fascinating field, and one of the most interesting things about it is the enormously illuminating questions that it enables us to ask about things like artificial intelligence, language, the light that it shines into the dark cavities of our brain. Before we had any kind of model for an information processing machine, we really had no way of thinking about the human brain very effectively. Now that we have got a model that may or may not equate to something to do with the way the brain works. Nevertheless, it's enormously illuminating. And all of the things to do with the way we communicate, the way we think, the way that we deal with information, the way that information deals with itself, if you like, all of these erupt out of computer science. And so that is an enormously fascinating field. I can still remember when I was at school, people who were doing computer science would be, kept behind after school, and you'd sort of peer in through the windows and you'd see them poking knitting needles through sort of stacks of cards, wondering what on earth are they doing? And of course they were preparing to rule the world. So I think computer science is something I would have loved to have done. Another one, I would have loved to have been a musician. And that's really something that has been a sort of just a sort of withered off little sort of tendril in my life, and that's something I would have loved to have done. I mean, there are lots of different things I could very happily have done.
Earlier portraits of you, when I've read the cuttings, etc., always put a bit of fun in about baths and Bovril sandwiches and things like that. Have those things disappeared from your life now with the advent of a marriage and a little daughter?
Yes, it's showers more often because they're quicker and you've got less time to waste. It's very curious what happens when you have a child, and every parent will know this, that before you have a child, people will say to you that nothing changes your life as much as having a child, and you just pay no attention whatsoever. It's a piece of information that whizzes straight past you. And then you have a child and you think, my God, nothing has prepared me for how extraordinary this is. How come nobody told me? And of course they did, but you weren't in a mind to listen.
I wish I'd listened to what my mother said.
Yes, exactly. And to be honest, there are one or two things I regret, though you can't. What I was going to say I regret is not having started earlier, because, here's an interesting fact. Polly was born when I was 42. There we go. And really it would have been quite a good idea, I think, maybe to have started a little earlier. But of course you can't revisit that, because any revisitation you do means that this very specific person, it's no longer a child, it's Polly. And if you've done anything in your life anyway differently, and you may well have another child, you may have lots of other children, but you wouldn't have this actual real person who has now become such a sort of central part of your life. And I find it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, apart from being a source of sort of enormous sort of joy and pleasure and so on, it's also just fascinating watching somebody beginning to make their kind of sense of the world, and seeing those sort of models beginning to erect themselves in her head, and the way in which I just find all that fascinating, as well as the sort of emotional thing. So yes, it's made a major difference.
Douglas Adams, thank you very much.
And for the Douglas Adams fans, here's the original song by the Eagles used as the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy's theme music, called Journey of the Sorcerer, from the One of These Nights album. Well, that's it for this hour of Air Checks. Next hour, we will be featuring Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. Stay tuned.